This afternoon is Adhil Bhagwandin. He would have been, as you know, introduced on Monday by Professor Graham Fegan. He will be talking to us today, so please welcome Adhil. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madi. Much appreciate the introduction. Welcome everybody to today's lecture. I am Dr. Bhagwandin. I'm from the Department of Human Biology, and I'm a comparative neuroscientist. And I've had the fortune of working with various different mammals over the last couple of years, and in my PhD and my postdoc. And I've done sleep studies in a lot of them, and so I wanted to share some of those experiences with you, and I wanted to give you an idea of what we've been learning from various mammals and their sleep patterns. So for today's lecture, we're going to switch over to the Animal Planet channel for about an hour or so, in a little bit of contrast to what you've been hearing in the last 2 days. But I, with that in mind, want to credit my previous speakers for the stellar job that they've done with their lectures and laying a very solid foundation of what sleep is and the various patterns of sleep and some reasons why humans sleep over the last 2 days. Today is going to be a little bit different, so hopefully it'll be a bit of fun as well. So let's get started. So you've been hearing over the last 2 days that sleep is a very common behavior, and sleep is everywhere. And basically what we're trying to say is that sleep is a ubiquitous event or behavior. Everything that we know sleeps, or everything has some form of rest activity. And because sleep is so common in that sense, it is a common biological behavior that we see amongst all organisms. It is fundamental in its function. And we do notice that when you have a lack of sleep, you tend to have rather ill effects. You don't feel very well, you feel rather grumpy, or you can feel rather irritated with certain things, and the effects can be quite drastic, especially so if you deprive yourself from sleep for an extended period of time. Perhaps some of us may have had the misfortune of experiencing some of that with the lack of sleep. In any case, sleep appears to be a very fundamental behavior across all organisms. With that in mind, the exact functions of sleep are very mysterious. This is often a debate amongst sleep physiologists as to, does sleep have an actual or a single function, or does it have multifunctions? And if so, what are those functions? And over the last couple of days, you've been hearing that there's a restorative function to sleep. It allows us to recuperate and so forth. The speaker yesterday spoke about memory consolidation during different phases of the sleep-wake cycle. So there appears to be lots of different functions that are associated with this behavior of sleep. What does sleep look like then amongst different species and different mammals? Firstly, it's highly variable between species. When we say highly variable, we're looking at things of when an animal goes to sleep, or when different mammals go to sleep, and we call that the timing of sleep. Also, the different durations, different species sleep, have different durations of sleep, or total amount of sleep that they sleep during the day or night for that matter. And also the different phases of sleep. And I will show you some of these examples during the course of this lecture. So yes, sleep is significantly variable amongst different species. But what can we learn from all of this, and what does understanding sleep in different mammals show us so far? And at this point, I want us to sort of put on our detective hats, and we're going to sort of look at some suspects, both usual and unusual, for some clues about sleep from different mammals. So for today's lecture then, the first, or the usual suspects that we're going to investigate, is looking at some basic concepts of sleep and comparing human sleep versus what we see commonly in other mammals. That's not going to take too long, and I'm not going to repeat too much of things because a lot of the detail was given to you in the last 2 days. So I'll be very brief in that section, but I want to highlight some important differences, similarities and differences at that point. Next, we'll move on to understanding understanding sleep in some of our aquatic friends. And we will look at two particular cases, which I've called Sealing the Deal and Half and Half. And we will learn more about sleep in a semi-aquatic environment and in the fully aquatic environment from these examples. Secondly, we'll return back to the land and look at some of our furry friends that live on land. And we will look at 4 different cases about that and try and understand what these and sleep in this natural environment, specifically in the terrestrial environment, is telling us and what we can learn from that. And lastly, I will just try and summarize some of the things that we've been learning from different mammals, and I will talk a little bit about the research that I'm currently doing. Okay, so you've already seen this before, and you probably know very well by now, more so in the last 2 days, that sleep, the behavior of sleep, is divided into 2 different phases. That which we call non-REM sleep and that which we call REM sleep. REM sleep is that rapid eye movement sleep that is often associated with dreaming, and you will learn more about that in the next couple of days. But the non-REM sleep is what was also talked about yesterday and the day before, and that's where we find those different phases of sleep, particularly in humans. I think Dr. Ray talked about that on Monday, about the different stages, 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and seeing the different wave patterns. Sorry, let me actually put my pointer on. There we go. So seeing the different stages of sleep and the different wave patterns that form part of those different stages of sleep. And so I'm not going to repeat what they spoke about because they gave you a lot of detail on that, but I do want to draw your attention to what that looks like, for example, in a rat. And we see a lot of similarities in this, particularly in wakefulness. We have that similar pattern of low amplitude, high frequency waves in wakefulness between the rat and the human. In the non-REM stages, we can see these spikes, and that's similar to those large, well, in the rat, it's more closer to what you're seeing here in the human stage 4. And these are your typical delta waves or slow waves that you would associate with the deeper stages of sleep. I really wanted to point out, before I do that, in any case, I wanted to just move on to REM sleep, and you see the similarities in REM sleep between human and rat. Again, those similarities of REM being very, very closely associated with wakefulness. The waveform looks very similar between REM and wakefulness. Again, high amplitude, low amplitude, high frequency waves, and you see a similar type of thing with the rats. So what is actually fundamentally different between the human and the rat, for example, is we can establish different stages in humans, and that's largely because, or stages of sleep rather, because humans have a much thicker cortex, cerebral cortex, and that allows better resolution in terms of the waveforms. A rat cortex is not as thick, and the waveform is slightly low in amplitude and doesn't give us the resolution, and we aren't able to define various phases of non-REM sleep as we have done in humans. So that's kind of one thing that I wanted to point out already amongst humans versus rats, for example. So the important thing to remember in this is that electrophysiological signals unique to both non-REM and REM have been identified in most mammals so far. Okay, that's a really, really important point. So again, it really establishes that sleep is such a common behavior, and its waveform even looks similar or mostly similar across different mammals. Sleep varies from order to order, and I've already mentioned that here, and I've put a little image here to show just how variable sleep is. And here you're seeing the various different stages of the sleep-wake cycle, wake being in yellow, REM sleep in this purplish color, and slower sleep in this sort of bluish aqua color. And you have different examples of mammals, and this just gives you an idea of how variable the different phases of sleep actually are amongst different mammals. So again, the point here is to try and remember that, or understand that sleep is a very variable behavior, but it serves an essential function. When we're looking at other things about sleep, it's not only good enough to look at sleep from different orders, but we also understand that sleep varies amongst different species of a single order. So if we look at rodents, for example, the smallest rodent and the largest rodent, they have various different patterns of sleep. The same for carnivores, the same for various other different groups of mammals, or what we call orders of mammals. And within those specific orders, the species that make up those orders have different types of sleep. Importantly, sleep does not appear to have any sort of relationship with body size or phenotype or lifestyle. By that we mean that it's very difficult to, and there doesn't seem to be a trend in most mammals rather, except for the herbivores, in the sense that if you look at body size, for example, in most mammals, there isn't a sort of relationship that says, if you're a big body size, you sleep a certain amount. If you're a small body size, you sleep a certain amount. There isn't a clear-cut relationship like that. The exception being the herbivores. And the herbivores seem to have a very weak correlation of an inverse relationship with sleep. In other words, what we're saying by that is larger mammals tend to sleep less, the herbivores specifically. So large herbivorous herbivores, size-wise, tend to have less sleep. And I will show you some examples a little bit later about of that sort of phenomenon, rather. So moving on, and you might have heard this before, but something to really establish in our minds when we're looking at human sleep versus sleep in other mammals is that humans are monophasic sleepers. When we say monophasic sleepers, it means that we typically have one episode of sleep broken up into various parts of it. So you go to sleep at once at night, in other words. Whereas in most other mammals, we call them polyphasic sleepers. So they have small episodes of sleep throughout the day and night. That obviously works in different environments. It works evolutionary, and those patterns have been established for very specific reasons. I wouldn't go into those details just yet, unless somebody really wants me to, So we'll keep it at that for now. And an important thing to consider, rather, is that sleep in the captive environment is considerably different from sleep in the natural environment. Animals in the wild sleep a lot less than animals in captivity. So if you're looking at zoo animals versus animals that live in the wild, of course in zoos there aren't predators around, and so that changes the way an animal will sleep. Predation is an important aspect in the natural environment, and sleep being the vulnerable behavior that it actually is, places an animal at huge risk for predation during that phase of sleeping. So what we find, and this was a fundamental study that was established a few years ago when one of our colleagues looked at sleep in the sloth, and they looked at sleep in a sloth in the laboratory, and then they recorded sleep from sloths in the natural environment, and they found this massive difference between the two different environments. And really that sparked a different interest in the field in terms of comparative understanding of sleep, because it shifted our focus into understanding a lot about what and how the natural environment shapes the behavior of sleep. Which is something that we ignored for many years. So I want to now just bring some of those to the surface, and using the different cases that I've talked about earlier, show you then how animals in their natural environment tend to sleep and what we can learn from them. In our first scenario, we're going to look at some of our friends that live in the ocean, and we will break this up into two pieces, like I said. One that is an animal that sleeps on both water and land, and one from an example from animals that live in the water. So before we get into that, let's try and shift our minds a little bit to understand some unique features of what it means to sleep in the water. Remember that we are mammals as well, and what we do see typically in mammals that sleep in the water, whether it's semi-aquatic or fully aquatic, is they have this type of sleep called unihemispheric sleep. The patterns of the EEG, and we spoke about the EEG yesterday. For some of you that may not know it, it's the electroencephalogram. What we see in these animals is that half their brain can be asleep at one point and the other half is awake. So this is really quite nicely established in this figure B and figure C. And these dots are various points and numbers are corresponding to what you are seeing in each of these different electrodes. And what the take-home message from this is that it appears that animals asleep in the water have this unique phenomenon of where they're able to sleep with half their brain while the other half is awake and then swap over between the hemispheres. Of course, every mammal has two hemispheres to the brain, which I'm sure all of you already know. So, and those two hemispheres swap in the aquatic environment. Also of importance is that there appears to be little to no REM sleep in the aquatic environment. And I will show you some examples of that. And this is very interesting. Yesterday, the speaker spoke a lot about what REM sleep is and the functions of REM sleep. And so for a mammal to exhibit no REM sleep, at least anything that anybody can measure at the moment, and or to suppress REM sleep, as you will see in some of the examples, is of interest. It's very curious. How are they able to do a lot of things if we are not observing this phase of sleep in these animals? So let's get on to our first group of animals, and I want to start off by talking about sleep in semi-aquatic mammals. Just to classify very quickly, when we talk about semi-aquatic mammals, we are referring to two large groups of mammals, scientifically called the pinnipeds and less scientifically called the sea otters. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the sea otters. They're very cute creatures, and there's often YouTube channels about them, and they have very unique social patterns. But I'm really going to focus my talk on the studies. I'm not aware of any sleep that's been done on sea otters rather. But certainly we have done studies in a few of the species that form part of the pinnipeds. So the walrus is a good example of the family called Odobenidae, and this southern Cape seal, the ones that you see out in Hart Bay and Seal Island, and even on at V&A waterfronts, they form part of a family called the Otariidae. And the Otariidae are what scientists and people refer to as the eared seals. If you look at them very closely, and this is not a great image of it, but you'll see the pinna of the ears, the ear lobes are sort of sticking out the sides of the head. And so we tend to call them very loosely the eared seals. So the Otariidae, an example is the southern Cape seal, is an example of a eared seal. A very close cousin to them is what we call the true seals. And this is a family known as Phocidae. And an example of a true seal is the harp seal. And I think a few weeks ago, there was a report of a harp seal that had lost its direction and landed up on one of the Cape Town beaches. But in any case, it's very far away from home because you normally find these animals in the Arctic or the Antarctic regions. In any case, the true seals don't have the pinna on the sides of their heads. And so, yeah, let's look at what sleep looks like in the harp seal. Strangely enough, even though these are animals that sleep in the water, and I said that there's some unique features about water, we don't seem to find any evidence of this unihemispheric or asymmetrical sleep that I talked about a little bit earlier in this particular species. And this seems to be a characteristic of the Phocidae family, the true seal family. Their sleep patterns, when they are sleeping, they are typically motionless on the land, and when they're in the water, they just seem to float, which is in stark contrast to the next animal we're going to talk about. But I wanted to mention this because it is important to show that variation again and understand, even though they're sleeping in the water and on land, they seem to have this bilateral. So in other words, both their hemispheres go to sleep at the same time, and they don't seem to exhibit that unihemispheric sleep that most other aquatic mammals do. In any case, when they sleep on the water and the land, they have similar amounts of sleep when they're in the water and when they're on the land. But importantly, in the water, they seem to suppress this REM sleep again. And this is a very curious thing for us as scientists, because we're still trying to understand why and how and what is the reason for animals that live in the water for them not having or having very little of this REM sleep, as will become a little bit more clearer in the next couple of examples. Okay, moving on. I did a lot of work with this particular group of animals, and so the northern fur seal is a cousin of the southern fur seal, and the northern fur seal is an example of an otariid seal, the eared seals. And here we see some beautiful images. So before I go into the details of the images, I really want to actually talk about the differences in their sleep patterns. So these animals spend a reasonable amount of time in the water, foraging for food and the likes, and often they spend quite a lot of time away from land, and they sometimes only return to the land for mating purposes. So these animals tend to sleep on the go. I like to call it sleeping on the go. So what we find is that when they're sleeping in the water, they tend to have this unihemispheric or asymmetrical sleep. We'll just call it unihemispheric for now. So they have this unihemispheric sleep in the water, and they have very little to no REM sleep. Actually, they actively suppress REM sleep in the water. The latest study has shown that. But when they come back to the land, they have this bihemispheric sleep, like we do. If we go to sleep, our brains look very similar to this. So here's an example of this fur seal sleeping on the land, and this is what its brain looks like. And you can see these large spikes here, representative of characteristic rather of those delta waves, and you can see both hemispheres are very nicely asleep. And then we have a very curious event, and this is a REM episode actually that occurs after the REM sleep, because what we see is almost a flat line in the muscle. And that is usually an indication of the muscle atonia. And in the previous lectures, they did mention this, that a very characteristic feature of REM sleep is this muscle atonia, and it exists so you don't act out your dreams. So here we see that flat line almost, and that's a really good indication that the animal has entered a phase of REM sleep. So this shows all the different phases of the sleep cycle that we talked about, and very characteristic of these. Even the position of these animals curled up like this is typical of what you find of them sleeping on the land. However, when we move into the water, it changes fundamentally. So if we look at the brainwave patterns again, here we see one hemisphere is awake. The left hemisphere is awake. And you can see that the left eye is above the water surface, and the nose is sticking above the water. The right hemisphere is asleep. Okay, so what you can't see on this is that the left eye is closed and the right eye is open. And basically, this pattern of sleep and these features are characteristic of this animal of sleeping in the water. Often what you'll find, and we see the similar type of thing in the left hemisphere. When the left hemisphere goes to sleep, again, we're seeing the right side here above the surface of the water, the nose out of the water, and the left eye would be open and looking down. And the reason why the eyes in the water is looking open and looking down is sort of keeping an eye out and keeping a vigilance for any presence of predators. And that's what we think, at least. So one of the typical things about them sleeping in the water is they'll often curl up their back fins, and with the fin that's close to the surface of the water, and it kind of looks like a sailboat. So we call it the sailboat position of them sleeping in the water. But importantly, as well, and in contrast to the true seals, what we see is that the one flipper that's in the water is constantly moving around. So they are moving while they are sleeping, in other words. Okay, so it's been really fascinating working with these animals and understanding these different phases of sleep and understanding how one animal can have all of these different features. And really, it was quite a nice in between, because terrestrial mammals sleep with both their brains and they show REM sleep all the time. And some aquatic animals, which we'll move on to a little bit later, have no REM sleep at all. And this is a nice in between. They have both. So it's a nice model animal to try and understand further aspects about sleep and wake, which is what we tried to do. And when we did further experiments with these animals, some very sophisticated experiments, I wouldn't get into the details of that. What we were trying to establish was in the different conditions and the different phases, that being the water and the unihemispheric sleep in the water and in the land and REM and no REM, what were the neurotransmitters that were being released at that time in the different conditions? And what we found essentially was that the only neurotransmitter that was actually released or lateralized in its release was acetylcholine. And that sort of seems to make sense when we're looking at waking patterns, and when we do, we know that acetylcholine is a promoter and a maintainer of wakefulness. So that sort of did make sense, but it was rather curious that no other neurotransmitter was bilaterally or is lateralized. And by lateralized, we mean in the same way that the animal would be sleeping. If one hemisphere was awake, the hemisphere that was awake was releasing this acetylcholine, and the hemisphere that wasn't awake didn't have this acetylcholine release. So that was very interesting for us to try and understand. Okay. So we'll move on to our next unusual suspect, and we'll look at sleep in fully aquatic mammals. So fully aquatic mammals are your dolphins and whales. And what we see in dolphins and whales is that their patterns of sleep they sleep with half their brain, like the seals do in the water. And we can see that by these different images here. So this is an example of a dolphin on the top here. These are two different hemispheres, and you can see when this hemisphere is asleep, that one is awake. When that one's asleep, this one's awake, and so forth. Okay, so the idea being that these show you that one half of the brain is awake and the other one's asleep, and they swap over between the two. A similar type of thing is seen then for the beluga whales. But of more interest for us is that no study so far has been able to establish any REM sleep in any cetacean species. And it has been a very curious, and people have pondered why, how, and why this would happen. And we think we have some ideas, but I'll save that for maybe a bit later if we have a bit of time. So, some characteristic features of sleep in cetaceans then is there's varying amounts of sleep between different species. You can see here a bottlenose dolphin and a harbor porpoise and a river dolphin versus a beluga, some of the things that have been studied. But really what's important to understand this is that the total amount of sleep time here in blue seems to be specific to each species and is variable amongst the species. But the time they spend in each hemisphere of sleep is not significantly different, even though there seems to be a large, this was shown to be not significantly different between the right and left hemispheres. So the hemispheres are sleeping a similar amount of time, in other words, or getting a similar amount of sleep. The aquatic environment is obviously, not obvious, but has shown us some fundamental changes to the patterns of sleep and the way sleep occurs, and the what we like to call the phenomenology of sleep. So let's now switch our attention a little bit to some terrestrial mammals and see what we can actually understand from their sleep patterns. And we will look at four furry friends of ours from the land. Some of them you may be very familiar with, some maybe not so much. Our first case is the elephant. Obviously, the elephant is an iconic African mammal. But for us, the elephant is a large herbivore. And given those stats that I talked about earlier about herbivores and the relationship, and there's a weak correlation to sleep, it was of interest to us to want to try and at least understand what sleep was like in an elephant. There were some studies that have been done in zoos, and those studies have shown that sleep in elephant in the zoos were about 4 to 8 hours, depending on which study you looked at. So we thought, okay, that's fairly interesting, but what would sleep look like in the natural environment? So we finally got the opportunity to do this. And of course, it wasn't done in traditional ways because not many people are going to allow you to put electrodes into an elephant's head. It's quite difficult in any case. In the normal circumstances, quite difficult to put electrodes in any animal's head, let alone an elephant, which has a sinus above the mantle of the head of 40 centimeters. So getting electrodes all the way down to that would be phenomenally difficult. So we had to think outside the box. And one of the ways we thought we could try to understand sleep in elephants was by using something called an accelerometer. And we use something called an ActiWatch. And many of you may be very familiar with this. You often find similar devices in your fitness devices. They all measure acceleration and movement, right? And so obviously the ones we were using were calibrated in a very scientific way, but the concept was very similar. And what we were trying to establish was whether and when and what durations there was inactivity in these animals. And that for us then extended periods of inactivity would more than likely indicate episodes of sleep without having to put electrodes into the brain. That is a technique that is commonly used these days, and it has a lot of validation among sleep scientists because the accuracy from those ActiWatches are very close to actual sleep patterns that you observe using electrodes on the brain. So these things have been validated in humans and various other animals, just to test the validity of those devices. In any case, all of that done, we decided to implant some electrodes on some of those ActiWatches into the elephants, and we found some interesting things. So what we established was that elephants tend to sleep about 2 to 4 hours per day. And what we couldn't establish, though, was because these devices don't give us very good resolution of brain activity, it was hard to tell when or whether these animals were having REM sleep. So ActiWatches do not give you information about the brain, and you need that to be able to establish when, because you're not following these animals around, and it's rather difficult to follow an elephant through the bush. I don't know if you've ever tried, but it's quite difficult to get through them and sort of follow them around. So understanding what sleep and whether they have REM is still something that's not very well known. But what we did put on them was a collar, and what we did get was information about recumbency. Recumbency animals usually sleep on their side, on whichever side, and usually because of that atonia in REM, we think that when these animals are being recumbent, they are having REM sleep. However, there's no way of us showing that, so we refrain from talking about REM sleep in the elephant so far. Here's some nice images to show and summarize what we saw. And we can see that from these graphs that the elephants spend, well, most of their time sleeping between 2 and 6 a.m. They really reach their peak of sleep around 4 o'clock in the morning. Right, so they would typically sleep 2 to 4 hours in this time frame. Of course, there were some times where they were asleep outside of this, but largely their sleep happened at night between 2 and 6 a.m. What was also of interest was that they tend to, well, matriarchs. We had one matriarch that was we think that this matriarch was being chased by a pack of lions, and she had calves with her, and so she was awake for 2 days. And I didn't show this data here, but I'm sort of just remembering it now. But the elephant was awake for 2 days. But interesting, yesterday somebody asked a question about, can you recover sleep that you've lost? And these animals didn't seem to have this rebound. And one of the things that we talk about is, if you deprive an animal of sleep, if you deprive rats, for example, of sleep, you'll often find that they'll have this rebound sleep to, I wouldn't say catch up, but try and make up and try and, they don't fully catch it up, but they try to get as much as rest as possible to make up sort of differences and deficits. But these elephants didn't seem to show that. They didn't show any rebound sleep. Which is very curious and very interesting. We still don't know what that means, but they didn't have that rebound sleep after spending 2 days completely awake, which is also of interest to us. So one of the things that we did during the study was we also had a weather station, and we recorded a whole bunch of different environmental conditions. Really what we were trying to fully established from all of this was, what is sleep like in the natural environment, and what are the conditions around an animal sleeping in the natural environment like? So environmental conditions in terms of temperature and wind speed and all these humidity, and we had about 20 different climatological factors that we were recording from our weather station. And when we put all that data together, we found something absolutely phenomenal. I'm going to say that because I'm a little biased, but we found something rather interesting, to be a little bit more politically correct. And so when we put the data together, climatologists often refer to something as the real feel of the environment, or what is known as the wet bulb globe temperature. And that's what WBGT here refers to, wet bulb globe temperature. And wet bulb globe temperature is a measure, it's a combination of air temperature and humidity. So this is a very well-known climatological combination, and it's used for various different reasons. But in our circumstances, when we put the data together and we looked at this wet bulb globe temperature, we found something very interesting. What we saw was that when the animals went to sleep, there was a very close relationship and a very strong correlation. In this particular case, 71% of the variation was explained by this minimum wet bulb globe temperature. In other words, this wet bulb globe temperature, or the real feel of the environment, was kind of influencing when the animal went to sleep. So we thought that was very interesting. Then we looked at when the animals woke up, and we found a much stronger correlation between what the minimum wet bulb globe temperature was, or the minimum real feel of the environment, and when they woke up. 94% of the variation was explained by this minimum wet bulb globe temperature. Now that's all fancy words to use. In other words, what we are trying to say is that the real feel of the environment seems to have a strong relationship with when an animal, or these particular elephants, went to sleep and when they woke up. So we thought, wow, this is really interesting. Is this just for the elephant? Is it just because it's a herbivore? Given those things those loose correlations that I mentioned earlier, this was all things that were going through our mind. And we thought, okay, well, why don't we do another animal that's very well known in Africa, and not just Africa, but in South Africa too. And so we wanted to examine sleep in the wildebeest. Now, many of us know that the wildebeest is an animal that does some unique behaviors too, because all of us know about the wildebeest migration through Tanzania and Kenya and sort of Middle Africa there. But what we were quite interested in is we heard an anecdotal evidence that wildebeest tend to not have any sleep. Absolutely no sleep was the quote that we heard when they're in the rut season. And the rut season is the time when they are about to mate and find mates and the likes. So we wanted to investigate all of this, and we found some really interesting things. What we found was that sleep was not completely eliminated during REM sleep, during the rut phase rather, but there were significant changes in the amount of sleep the animal had before the rut activity, during the rut activity, and after the rut activity. So all of this is showing the amount of inactivity these animals have. This is a combination of both electrophysiological data. So we did manage to put electrodes in these animals. And this was a study done in South Africa, not in the wild migration up in Africa, in Kenya and the likes. But this is showing us that sleep does change a little bit during the rut season. What we also established was these animals tend to sleep about 4.5 hours a day. But again, what we did was we measured the environmental conditions. And what we found was, again, a very close relationship between when the animals went to sleep and the minimum wet bulb globe temperature. Sorry, the G is missing from this. But the real field in the environment, again, was having an influence on when the animals went to sleep. Not just when they went to sleep, but when they woke up from sleep. So that sleep offset was also being dictated by what the wet bulb globe temperature at that time was. So this was very interesting at this point, because now we have two herbivores that are fundamentally different in size and lifestyle, but they're showing a similar trend in terms of when they're going to sleep and when they're coming out of sleep. And it seems to be associated and linked to something happening into the environment. So we thought, well, why not try an animal that lives in an extreme environment? What would be the effect on sleep? Or would there be any effects on sleep in an animal that lives in an extreme environment? So a few years ago, we managed to get permission, and after a long period of waiting, we managed to record sleep in the Arabian oryx. This was done in Saudi Arabia. And this is a picture of one of the animals that we actually used, and you see where our surgical implants actually are. So I promise we did it all very legitimately and legally. So these animals, firstly, let's consider the environment. The Arabian desert is an extreme environment. It's a desert. It has fluctuations of extreme temperatures in the summer through to lower temperatures in the winter season. And for us, that was a unique opportunity to understand, well, many different things about sleep. One, what does an extreme environment do to sleep? And what could we understand what we were seeing in these other herbivores about the sleep timing? So firstly, about their sleep patterns. If we look at what these animals do in the winter versus the summer months, so the bottom graph here is their summer behavior, and the top graph here is their winter behavior. And so in winter, we can see that they are sleeping mostly during the night. They have a bit of sleep during the day, and then again in the night. And these two blue lines here, the dotted line is what their body temperature was doing, and the solid line was what the outside air temperature actually was. In summer, we see something fundamentally different. They appear to be sleeping more during the daytime. And this was very interesting for us. We were wondering why. Why would these animals be sleeping so much more during the daytime? Until we looked at the body temperature data. And then we realized that, so if you look at the values here, right, you see in the winter months, their body temperature occasionally goes up to the peak of their body temperature in the winter months is about 40 degrees, a little bit higher than us as humans, but they live in an extreme environment. However, in the summer, the peak of their body temperature goes up to 45 degrees. That's dangerously high for any mammal. And what they appear to be doing is using that sleep or the behavior of sleep to actually cool themselves and their brain. Now, this is important because when we look at studies between different rats and different mammals, for that matter, and even in humans, we do the same thing. When we go to sleep, our brain temperature starts dropping off. It starts cooling down at a certain point. Right? So it makes complete sense then that these animals would be using this behavior of sleep to try and cool their brain down. You obviously don't want to overheat your brain, and that's never a good thing. Whilst heat stroke is a dangerous event, both in humans and even more so in animals that live in such extreme environments. So sleep as a behavior was being used in a very unique way in these particular animals. So the range of sleep was quite drastic. We saw that they changed from 3.7 to 6.7 hours, and that's largely because of the differences between the summer and winter months. Interesting as well, when we looked at the data between the environment and sleep, again, we found this very strong correlation of what was happening in the environment, the real feel of the environment, and when they were going to sleep. Similarly, when they were waking up. So despite the extremities of, or the extreme nature of the desert environment, the sleep in these animals was still sort of following a pattern that was seemed to be dictated by this web bulb globe temperature information. So that was very interesting. I mean, we started thinking more and more about this, and we wanted then to really understand what would this be like in other conditions. And so we got an opportunity to, or a few did not finish, and I wasn't involved with the work that was done in the sand people, but in any case, before I get into that, we got an opportunity to understand sleep patterns in 3 pre-industrial societies. So the Hadza people in Tanzania, the Somali people in Bolivia, and the Sand people in Namibia. And these are very hunter-gatherer communities, still living a very traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They don't have electricity, they don't have any of those luxuries or amenities that we find in the modern human environment. So we were curious about sleep in many different ways about this, because we wanted to know what did sleep look like in these pre-industrial societies, and what could we learn from them about their sleep patterns in these pre-industrial societies. And what we did find was that their total sleep time was about 5.9 to 6.5 hours amongst all 3 different groups. And this was done in various times of the year and a similar time between winter and summer months and the likes. And consistently, it showed 5.9 to 6.5 hours of sleep for these pre-industrial societies. Interestingly, though, these societies did not have any naps. They didn't take any naps during the day or on the weekends or any of those things. So that was very different for us to try to understand, because ourselves, myself included, we prone to having a big meal, having a nap afterwards, and the likes. So these pre-industrial societies showed none of that, actually. So we then were also very curious about the environment again. And I think you're getting the point now, that when we looked at what is happening in the wet bulb globe temperature with the 3 different societies, this was done with the sand people only. We're still trying to get permissions to find similar information with the Hadza and the Somali people in Bolivia. But with the sand people, what we did observe was that the real feel again was having an influence on when they went to sleep and when they came out of sleep. So here the correlation was a little weak, 54% of the time, or the correlation was 54%. But we tend to think that there's a lot of social behavior going on here, and that variation among social, that sociality was sort of influencing when people would go to sleep. However, when we looked at when they were waking up, that was more consistent and a much stronger type of relationship relative to what was happening in the environment. So out of all my blabbing, what does this mean? When we look at it all together, what we can say at the moment is that from these 4 different species, and these are 4 unique species of animal, humans and other mammals, and we see then that there is a very tight relationship between what is happening in the real field of the environment in this wet bulb globe temperature and when a particular animal is going to sleep, humans included. The pre-industrial humans included. So what this figure here is showing, and something that's important to remember, is this is a pattern of wet bulb globe temperature measured in the 4 different societies and the 4 different examples. And what we find is that it reaches its peak in the sort of mid-afternoon, and as the sun starts to set, the wet bulb globe temperature starts to drop. It continuously starts to drop until the sun rises, and then starts increasing again. So that's the pattern of what happens with wet bulb globe temperature over a 24-hour cycle. The green lines here, the arrows rather, show when each of those different species went to sleep, the time that they went to sleep. So here we see the sand, just around 10 o'clock at night or somewhere around there, the Arabian oryx and the wildebeest, and then the elephant. But importantly, what is really interesting is that all 4 different groups woke up well before the sun rose. Okay, so not only is sleep being influenced by what is happening with this wet bulb globe temperature, we tend to be with these particular animals seem to be going to sleep well after the sun sets and well before the sun rises, which is important because I'll explain that a little bit later, but let's carry on. So what are we learning from all of this then? In the aquatic environment, we are seeing that sleep and the pattern of sleep and the architecture of sleep is being changed fundamentally. And this lack of REM is still of particular interest to us. And what we do understand a little bit more now is that there appears to be very sophisticated neural mechanisms that are sort of allowing the animals to cope with the aquatic environment. And what I mean is that I told you earlier that brain temperature seems to decrease as we're going in non-REM sleep. And while we're sleeping, your brain temperature starts to decrease. But it's also important to remember that in the water, you lose heat to the water about 16 times quicker than you do to air. So, which means that in the water, you would be losing that heat very quickly, and your brain temperature could be dropping very quickly. So what we think, and we've shown this in some other studies that we've done, is that there are particular thermoregulatory mechanisms, kind of like a shivering mechanism. It's a brain shivering mechanism in a sense, that is keeping these animals, their brain temperature at a particular level. And perhaps we think then that is the mechanism that is avoiding this REM type behavior. There's still a lot of work to be done on this, so I'm sort of mentioning this from the little work we've done so far. But importantly, aquatic sleep has a lot of clues and a lot of secrets at the same time, and we still yet to unlock many of those secrets about what it means sleeping in the water. When we look at what terrestrial mammals are showing us, we see that the wet bulb globe temperature, or rather the real field of the environment, appears to be a more strong driver for the timing of sleep in the natural environment. By this, I mean is that it seems to be the biggest influence on when a particular species goes to sleep and when a particular species comes out of sleep in the natural environment. Previously, we have always thought it was light. That light was the cue, that light was the dictator, so to speak, of when and how these things happened. But now with this recent information, we tend to think that light acts as an early warning system. It's basically saying the light is gone, you should consider going to sleep, if I can put it rather loosely. And what really makes these particular animals go to sleep then is a real feel of the environment. And there's a lot more that needs to be done with this, and a lot more animals that need to be understood to see if this is a general phenomenon across mammals or indeed across vertebrates for that matter. But if it is true, it has the power to fundamentally change how we understand sleep. So overall, sleep, while being a very common behavior, is still a mystery, and there is loads for us to be understood. It keeps me very happy because there's lots for me to do. But I really wanted to just very quickly talk a little bit about what research I'm doing and a new thing in sleep. And this is about the glymphatic system. And so I wanted to try and just very quickly just talk about how the glymphatic system and sleep, what is the actual connection between it. So we know that the brain produces a lot of metabolic waste. And the mechanism of this waste removal was recently discovered and was labeled as the glymphatic system. So what is the glymphatic system exactly? And the glymphatic system is an astrocytic network of pores and channels that effectively clears metabolic waste into the venous system. It does this by mixing CSF surrounding the arteries, mixing that CSF. The CSF sort of leaks into the brain parenchyma and mixes with the interstitial fluid, and it creates a flow, a gradient flow from the artery to the veins. And in doing this, it sweeps, if I can put it very loosely, it sweeps the toxins and metabolic waste from the neurons into the venous system. The system was largely established in mice a few years ago, 2015 to be exact. And one of the very important things about this is that this system, this glymphatic system, seems to be most active during non-REM sleep. Now that's really important. So when we are in our deep sleep, this system seems to be working to be getting rid of all that toxin. All those toxins that the neurons are producing. Now, what does this actually mean? So this can give us a better understanding, or a better understanding of this glymphatic system can assist us in unraveling further secrets of complex neurodegenerative diseases, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and the likes. But why should we study different animals in this? Why not just study the rats and the mice and then translate that to the humans and be happy with that? Well, from my perspective, I think by now through this lecture, I'm hoping rather that you would have seen just how variable sleep is in various mammals. And it is this variation that is very important and gives us an opportunity to understand the glymphatic system. This comparative understanding of the glymphatic system gives us an insight into what the resolution on the resilience of the glymphatic system might be. How resilient is it? How much does it change? Does it change different animals that sleep differently, and so forth? And so that is basically the research that I'm doing, and this is the last slide from me. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I think our furry friends would like to say goodbye as well. So thanks very much. Happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Adhil, for that fascinating talk. I mean, what wonderful research you are doing. Let's see if there are any questions.
Aha, yes, that was very interesting. Enjoyed all of that about the animals. But I wondered, do they also have the problem of insomnia? Do you get some animals that can't go to sleep?
That's a very good question. We don't quite know what insomnia looks like in different animals, and it's very difficult to establish that because these animals can go for, like the elephant, for example, that could be considered as an insomnia. But I don't know if it'll qualify on the human characteristics of what insomnia actually is, because we can't get an emotional basis from the animals of what's really happening. So it's not like they can tell us, I feel this or I feel that. And so it's hard to gauge whether that is having particular deleterious effects on their behaviors. So I can't fully answer that question because we don't know how to establish that, to be honest.
Thank you. I also wondered why we actually, when you go to the game reserve, you stay indoors at the heat of the day because you say the animals are all sleeping. And they're all going to come out at night. But you told us today that the animals are actually going to bed at night and awake in the day.
Yeah, that's quite true. I think in South Africa and certain parts of it, it does get quite warm. Probably not to the extent of the desert, but yes, I think that is quite true. But we've also got to consider that whether an animal is diurnal or nocturnal in their circadian rhythms, and that will significantly influence when an animal will sleep as well. So yes, I think that's something to be very good and very well aware of when you go into the national parks the next time.
I'm a tourist guide and I've spent a lot of time in various game reserves. And one of the consistent rumors that goes around is that lions, at least male lions, sleep for 23 hours a day. Can you make any comment on that?
Yes, there are no conclusive evidence on lions and their sleep, but what we tend to think is that they don't sleep. Having looked at their brain, and I just had a colleague who looked at the inside of the brain, what we think is that whilst lions may appear asleep, they're not actually sleeping. They spend a lot of time in what we call quiet wake. So they are in this very, they look like they're asleep, their eyes are closed, but they're not really asleep, to put it very simply. So what we think is that lions sleep probably about 7 or 8 hours a day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. For this, the sand bushmen, you say they start waking up before light. So is it this wet bulb global temperature that's waking them up? What is waking it? Because they obviously haven't got artificial light. If it's not the dawn, what is causing them to wake up, do you think?
So it's exactly what you're saying. It's this wet bulb globe temperature that seems to wake them up from their deep sleep, and when it reaches a minimum, an absolute nadir of that wet bulb globe temperature. That seems to be the trigger of when they wake up. So yes.
Thank you.
I think many of us may have experienced that. If you've gone camping before, you often, you could be up till late at night, but you wake up rather early in the morning when you're camping, and so that is an insight into potentially what this system that we're trying to understand is all about.
Thank you.
Hi there. I just wanted to know, what does EMG actually stand for, and also SWS? I missed that.
So EMG is electromyogram. It measures activity in muscles. And usually that we use that as a nice way to understand what's happening with the brain and the muscles, because when you go into sleep, your muscles tend to relax. So you have less activity in your muscles, and that is a way for us to confirm that a certain episode is happening, particularly when we're looking at REM sleep. Because the EEG pattern in REM sleep is so similar to that of waking, we don't want to call an episode of REM sleep a wake episode or wake episode a REM episode. So we use various different measures, and one of them is the muscle activity, another one is eye activity, another one is heart rate, to give us more resolution on particular phasing of the sleep-wake cycle. And slow wave sleep, SWS stands for slow wave sleep, which is basically non-REM sleep.
Okay, another just quick question. I've got a watch that measures my sleep. And it can tell me the REM sleep and deep sleep and light sleep and when I've woken up. Mm-hmm. Now I can work out waking up is when you have consistent movement with your arm, I presume. Mm-hmm. Light sleep, I'm not sure how they distinguish between that, but also but REM, how would the watch be able to tell you if you're REM sleeping? I suppose, yeah. How can it do that?
So that's a really good question. One of the things that these devices tend to do is they measure heart rates. And there's well-known sort of events that happen during REM sleep. Your heart rate becomes very erratic. So my presumption then would be is that there's an algorithm with this to say, okay, if you are picking up on this erratic behavior, that's likely to be a REM episode.
Adil, it's Dale Ray here. I wonder if I can quickly jump in there.
Yes, of course. Yes, I didn't know you're here. Sorry, you would be able to tell more details on that, of course.
No, I think that the conclusion at the moment with regards to wearables that are on the market for members of the public is that they definitely cannot tell you accurately when you're in REM sleep. The idea behind the heart rate variability, as you've explained, is quite correct, but the algorithms are not yet sensitive enough to be accurate. And so we really take that with quite a bit of a pinch of salt. For example, a person could have an underlying heart issue in which they have a very erratic heartbeat, and then that can then come forward to it looking at like they're doing a lot of REM during the night when actually it's not true. So at best, I recommend that people use their sleep watches just to look at patterns from night to night and don't place too much store on which stage of sleep you're in, because they're not particularly good at doing that yet.
Thank you, Dale. That's
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much again, Adil, and to everybody who listened this evening.
Thanks, everybody.